starting off with the Manhunt. So this is Simon Armitage's 1990s poem, and the poem actually gained a nickname. It was called Laura's poem, who was the wife it was based on. And the fact that it's gained that sort of nickname highlights its prominence in society, that it sort of took on its life of its own, and it was very, very well received. And I think that contextually, you know, we can link that into this idea that he really effectively captures the sort of focus and preoccupation that we have nowadays on the psychological effects of war, and obviously the impact on relationships that everybody has to live with. I think especially now we're a lot more aware of soldiers' injuries from war and the care that we give to people after they come back from war. And this obviously focuses very well on the mental and physical and emotional effects of war, sort of perfectly reflecting our own society's emphasis, like what we focus on. You've obviously got this sort of build-up of this wife sort of trying to explore her husband across his body. There's lots of natural imagery about rivers, etc., that kind of gives this idea that she's kind of making her way around him. You've also got the idea of the river is frozen, so obviously you've got these kind of limitations. So all the way through, it's kind of only then, only then, only then. But towards the end, we have this sort of crescendo, this build-up, where suddenly there's an absence of only then, and it's the fetus. Then I widened, to a sweating, every nerve. So you've got this kind of increase of pace towards the end that reflects she's actually making some progress and she's getting somewhere. The key image in the poem is obviously this unexploded mine, so this constant presence of war in his head even long after he's come back. So you've obviously got the symbolism there that war never leaves you. What's really interesting though is that the mine is sweating, so you've got this sort of blend of natural and artificial, where this artificial object, a mine, is sweating, which is a very natural sort of physical thing for a living organism to do. So you've got this idea that in his head there's this combination now of natural and artificialness that he can't shake away, and that the experiences of war, which are an artificial, they're not something he was born with, they're not something that belong to the world, they're abnormal and unnatural. To go through those experiences, they're now embedded into him, they're part of him now, and he can't escape them. And that's kind of a key image that would get you a lot of marks in the exam if you can really dive into that and explore this idea of him kind of being trapped in his own mind. Armitage himself wanted to evoke shock with this poem. He really wanted to make people feel emotionally connected to the damage that it does, not just to the body but to the relationships. And you've actually kind of got three perspectives. You can infer how the man himself feels, you can infer how the wife feels, and you can also infer about the relationship. And the wife, you know, there's a lot of patience here that we can get from how she moves, and the only then and the only then, and the pace. And, you know, there's a sense of loyalty there, because if she gave up on him, imagine the impact that would have on him as well. And at the end, you're kind of left with this idea that she's never going to quite get there again, that there's always going to be something between them, and that's obviously the experiences of war. It's important to remember when you're comparing that Armitage had never been to a war zone, but he can certainly empathise with these issues in a relationship, whereas someone like Wilfred Owen, who was in the war zone, couldn't really empathise with the after effects of it, because he died during the war, so he never got to have that chance, and certainly lived at a time where we didn't really understand the psychological aspects of it. So yeah, that is The Manhunt. Okay, moving on to The Soldier by Rupert Brooke. Obviously this is the earliest war poem in the anthology, and it very much captures the pre-1914 sense of what war poetry was. So traditionally before World War I, war poetry was all about celebrating heroes, helping to remember those who died, celebrating the glory really of dying for your country. And all of the poets would sit at home at their desks miles and miles and miles away from these exotic lands where wars are being fought, and they would write poems to capture and I guess to help the grieving families as well, and to keep the country on side to the war. However, during World War I, this all changed, and this is the important sort of contextual evidence that you need for both The Soldier and Dulce, is that World War I, as you probably know from history, it got so many soldiers like masses and masses more than any other war previously, which resulted in obviously conscription, which meant that people were forced to go, and that the poets were no longer sat behind a desk, they were sat in a trench in World War One. So they were far more first-hand experienced in what war was like, and as a result, war poetry became far more horrific and realistic. The Soldier, however, because it was written so early on in the war, during the first year, by Rupert Brooke, who was quite middle class, he was quite well off. So Rupert Brooke still reflects the sort of traditional war poetry pre-1914. So in a way, he's behind his time, really, or he kind of marks the transition from patriotic war poetry to realistic war poetry. So this is embedded throughout the whole poem, the way he celebrates England, which is the most repeated word in the text, the way he sees his own body as being detached from him. He says, a body of England, not my body. So the use of the indefinite article a, as opposed to a possessive pronoun my, really emphasises that he feels detached, that he gives his body to England, that he's a product, he's manufactured by his country. And that kind of reflects the mindset of the soldiers at that time, that when you sign up to war, you become your country's property, and that's kind of a contract you're willing to do because of the glory you feel you're going to have. I think what's important here, despite it being a war poem, there's little impact. There's very little focus on violence or the actual dynamic verbs you'd expect to see about fighting or what it feels like to be in a war. He's very much focused on his overall sort of more spiritual purpose, and in that respect there's a bit of romanticism in here, that he sort of looks at he sees himself as part of a bigger whole, a sort of more spiritual, maybe even transcendent purpose, that he's there to defend his country. This sort of something bigger than him. He's there for the greater good. There are some elements though that maybe he is afraid to die, and that he is kind of, even this, the fact, if I should die, I think only this of me, that he's actually realizes that it is a possibility. But on the other side, you can also highlight that it's a conditional. He doesn't say when I die, so he's certainly optimistic. Obviously this is a sonnet, and that is important to try and get in, and again that link ties into romantic poetry as well. The first bit, the octet, really focuses on his body, whereas the sestet focuses on his soul. So you've kind of got those both. It's quite religious in a way. It's almost like he's writing his own eulogy for after he's died. And that again is a traditional sonnet, where the second stanza marks a change in focus. Okay, moving on to Dulce, which is my personal favourite of the war poems, because I think there's just loads you can analyse. There's tons and tons of language analysis that's really rich, really good sound analysis. So you can analyse the cacophony of the harsh sounds in stanza 1 with all the hard A sounds like sax, and coughing and knock-kneed, and then the horrible trudging sort of liquid consonants and liquid sounds that really slow you down in the sludge and the udge. The assonance of you that really sort of slows the reader down, and you really feel like you're walking. The words themselves are walking through mud. It really effectively uses language to convey the men's journey. Stanza 1 is very much focused on the physical impacts of war, and you've got this kind of loss of senses. They're lame, they're blind, they're drunk, where you've got sort of loss of mental sense and being able to comprehend your world. They're deaf as well. So again, the loss of senses, it's like they're losing their ability to process the world, which highlights that actually if you can't process the world, you're not really a part of it anymore. And that links to the idea of them being old beggars, that they're now outcasts, not of society, but of the human race almost, that wars deform them and stop them being human. There's a sense of sort of euphony at the end of that verse. You've got the gas and shells dropping softly, and you've got this kind of calm environment, which highlights again the detachment, because that is not what a bomb dropping would sound like, but to the soldiers it is, because A, they're just used to it now, so that it's lost its impact, and B, they're just so detached they can't even comprehend things properly. So then how are they supposed to fight and protect themselves? You've then got this great juxtaposition to stanza 2 of the gas attack come in and the quick exclamatives, and there's an increase of rhythm here to highlight that they're all rushing to get the gas masks on. There's unexperience of the fumbling and clumsy helmets, and then obviously we've got this one man who's left. He doesn't get his gas mask on in time, and he's left in a thick green light and a green sea, and he dies. And you've got here these really Owen emphasising the power of the gas, because he calls it a thick green light, he calls it a sea, and he says it's a misty pain. And you've actually got sort of three states of matter there. You've got the gas, you've got a pain, which is a solid, and you've got a sea, which is obviously the liquid. It really highlights how overpowering the gas is, and contextually this is the first war where gas was used, so it's a new weapon, and Owen's obviously effectively highlighting how terrible a weapon it was. You've also got a very subtle implication there in stanza 2 of the word limelight, of the last words on lines 12 and 13, which together, well, it emphasises that you've got this broken limelight, and that links to stanza 3, where at the end Owen really protests against the idea that at that time during World War I, soldiers were sold a lie that they'd sign up and they'd be a hero and they could die a hero, and the reality was that they either died choking in that horrific way from the gas, which is emphasised. Sorry, I don't know if I just said stanza 3 then and I meant the last stanza. Obviously the guttering, the choking and the drowning really emphasises how horribly he died, but this limelight that they were promised was a lie. So he really effectively breaks that up in stanza 2 as a sort of preemption of what he then goes on to really strongly, openly rhetoric. You know, he uses really great rhetoric at the end of, you know, my friend, and talking to the reader, and this emphasising of desperate glory, and the horrible language that he uses, like devil sick of sin and jolt and the froth corrupted lungs. He also uses present tense there as well, so that we as readers also feel part of the event. There's like loads of students walking past, so I'm just going to pause. One last thing to say for Dulce then is that this is one of the most sort of preserved war poems. It kind of is synonymous with post-1914 war poetry. Wilfred Owen is one of the top war poets alongside Sassoon, and this poem itself is really, really embedded into our culture as the thing that's, you know, survived over time to help us remember how horrific World War I is. So in a way, it's taken on a life of its own. It's an important historical document. It's not just a poem, and that's important contextual point to make, that it's had that power on our society even today, that it didn't just change people's perceptions at the time. So moving on to the last war poem, which is Mametz Wood, Owen Shears. Contextual key information is that typical Owen Shears poetry is focused on places, but also more specifically how people interact with the places. And in this poem, he really focuses on war and how the sort of fields and environments of France where the war was fought, how the people after they've died are now interacting with that environment, and how people who are alive are interacting with it. So you've kind of got three aspects. You've got the woods themselves, the people who are ploughing the woods and still living there, and then you've got the bones of the dead soldiers as well. So those three aspects. Other contextual information then is that the Mametz Wood was the scene of a fierce battle in the Somme, which was a massive event where boys were just sent to walk at machine guns. They were sent to get into the other trenches when there was still barbed wire that hadn't been cut, so they were just left on the barbed wire to die. It was a horrific, tragic waste of life, very famously. So firstly, the fact that the poet is writing about this in the 2000s really highlights and sort of helps us to remember that event in itself, but that is also one of his key themes about how we remember these dead soldiers, which he himself is contributing to. Owen Shears is Welsh, and it was the Welsh who were ordered to take the wood during the war, and in World War I everyone was grouped up into regiments based on where they were from. I'm pausing because Mr. Vose is coming. Okay, so because of that, obviously there was a massive amount of men who died in Mametz Wood were Welsh themselves. So they actually succeeded in their mission, which is quite rare in the Somme because they were given ridiculous missions to do. However, they weren't really acknowledged, so this poem is kind of contextually also a reflection of the power of poetry. That this poem, by being written, because the poet sat down and wrote this poem, he's now managed to capture the memories and help in our society us to appreciate what happened 100 years ago. So you've got kind of the idea of the power of writing here as well and what that can do.